I spent 31 years working the line at a steel fabrication plant in Gary, Indiana, and I've got the hands to prove it. Thick fingers, scarred knuckles, palms that no amount of lava soap ever fully cleaned. My wife used to say my hands looked like something you'd find in a museum about the Industrial Revolution. She didn't mean it as an insult. She meant it as a compliment, the way only someone who loved you truly could. She passed 8 years ago, and some mornings I still reach for her side of the bed before I remember. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I live in the same house I bought in 1987. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with 212,000 miles on it, and I raised one son who turned out to be the finest man I know. His name is Martin. He's 34 now, manages a distribution logistics team for a mid-size company out of Columbus, Ohio. Bought his own house at 29. Calls me every Sunday without fail. Never missed a birthday, never forgot a Father's Day, never once made me feel like visiting him was an inconvenience. If I'd done one thing right in this life, it was raising that boy. He met his wife, Bethany, about 4 years ago, through mutual friends at some kind of work conference. She's from outside of Dayton. Her father is a financial consultant, the kind with a corner office and a golf membership, and her mother taught at a private school for most of her career before retiring early. Nice people on the surface, the kind that shake your hand firmly and smile with all their teeth and ask polite questions about your life without really listening to the answers. I noticed it from the first time Martin brought her home for Christmas. Not anything she said, not one word out of line, just the way Bethany's eyes moved around my house when she walked in. Quick little glances. The carpet in the hallway, the wood paneling in the living room I never got around to replacing, the collection of fishing tackle on the shelf by the back door. She took it all in the way you take in a place that surprises you. Not pleasantly. Martin didn't notice. He was too busy being happy, and I wasn't about to say a word to disturb that. I liked Bethany fine overall. She was smart. She could carry a conversation. She made Martin smile in a way I hadn't seen since he was 12 years old and unwrapped a used dirt bike on Christmas morning. She was good to him, and that was what counted. Whatever her family thought about me and my F-150 and my Gary, Indiana house with the wood paneling, I didn't lose sleep over it. Or I tried not to. The wedding was in September of last year, out at a venue in Dublin, Ohio. Beautiful property, rolling green lawn, a white tent, string lights that went up in the trees around the outdoor reception area. Bethany's parents paid for most of it, which I understood and respected. They had the means. I contributed what I could. Covered the rehearsal dinner, bought the honeymoon hotel for the first 2 nights, and gave Martin a check that represented a good portion of my savings without him ever knowing how much it stung. I sat at the family table and ate prime rib and danced badly to a song I didn't recognize. And I watched my son look at his wife like she was the whole world, and I was grateful. Whatever I thought about the way her mother talked past me at the cocktail hour, whatever I noticed about the way her father never once asked me about my years at the plant, none of it mattered that evening. Martin was happy. That was the ceiling of what I needed. The trouble started small, the way it always does. Martin and Bethany came to visit me in October, about a month after the wedding. Good visit. I made pot roast. Bethany ate 2 helpings and said it was delicious, and I believed her. She seemed more relaxed than usual, more comfortable. I thought maybe we were turning a corner. Then at Thanksgiving, plans shifted. Martin called me in early November, which was earlier than usual for holiday planning. I figured he was just being organized. He and Bethany were hosting their first Thanksgiving in their home in Columbus. First big hostings as a married couple. Her parents would be there, her sister and brother-in-law, a couple of family friends. He asked if I wanted to come, and I said, of course. What did he want me to bring? He paused. Just a half-second pause. But I've known Martin's voice for 34 years, and a half-second pause from that boy tells me something. Dad, he said, maybe just bring yourself. Bethany's handling the menu with her mom. Sure, I said. I can bring a pie or rolls, whatever's easy. Another pause. I'll check with Bethany and let you know. He never called back about it. I didn't push. I drove up to Columbus on Thanksgiving morning. 5-hour drive in the F-150, made it in 4:45 because the highway was clear and I left before 6. Brought a bottle of wine. I asked the woman at the liquor store to help me pick out a bouquet of grocery store flowers for Bethany and a tin of butter cookies from the German bakery on Jefferson that Martin's been eating since he was 9 years old. I parked on the street outside their house just after 10:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet, nice area, good houses, well-kept yards. Martin had done well for himself, and that still filled me with something I don't have a word for. Something big and warm that sits right behind the sternum. I grabbed my things and walked up to the front door. Bethany answered. Oh, she said, just that. Oh, you're early. Said I'd be here around 11. It's 10:45. I smiled and held out the flowers. Happy Thanksgiving. She took them and stepped back to let me in. The house smelled incredible. Turkey and sage and something sweet, probably a pie. The kitchen was clearly in full operation. Her mother, Rhonda, was at the island rolling out something on a floured board, and she looked up when I came in and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James, she said. Not warm, not cold. Perfectly calibrated neutral. Rhonda, good to see you. Smells amazing in here. Bethany's been up since 4. She always was an early riser, I said, even though I had no idea if that was true. Just trying to fill the air with something that didn't have an edge to it. Martin came downstairs a few minutes later and hugged me the way he always does. Hard, like he means it. He looked good, rested, happy in the way that a man looks happy when he's building something solid with another person. We went into the living room and talked while the women worked in the kitchen, and everything felt fine. Bethany's father, Gene, arrived around noon with her sister's family. Gene is the kind of man who arrives and immediately adjusts the energy in a room without meaning to. Not hostile, just large in a certain way, confident in his opinions, accustomed to being the most credentialed person present, quietly aware of square footage and property values. He shook my hand and said, James, good to see you, in a tone that suggested he was completing an item on a checklist. Dinner was called at 2 o'clock. Martin had set the table himself. I could tell because the napkin folds were lopsided the same exact way they were lopsided every time he set the table as a kid, and I told him it didn't matter as long as the table was set. I loved those napkins. We sat down. Gene said grace, which was his right as Bethany's father, and I bowed my head and meant it. I'm not a man who performs faith. I just have it quietly, the way I have most things. The meal was good. The conversation moved around topics I wasn't always part of. A vacation Gene and Rhonda were planning to Portugal, the school district where Bethany's sister had just bought a house, a financial instrument Gene was enthusiastic about, that I understood approximately nothing of. I ate my food and asked questions when it seemed natural and listened more than I talked. That's always been my way. Then Bethany's sister's husband, a man named Craig, who sold commercial real estate and wore a blazer to Thanksgiving dinner, turned to me and asked what I'd done for work. Steel fabrication, I said. Line supervisor for most of it. Gary, Indiana plant, 31 years. He nodded the way people nod when they want to move on. You retired? Going on 3 years now. What do you do with yourself? Fish, I said. Fix things. Read. Drive up to Columbus to see my son. I smiled at Martin. He smiled back. Craig nodded again and turned to Gene and asked something about a mutual acquaintance in commercial development. And I was released from the conversation as neatly as I'd been entered into it. I didn't mind. I went back to my green bean casserole and listened to Martin tell a funny story about a logistics nightmare he'd navigated in September. And I watched his face while he talked and felt that big warm thing behind my sternum again. After dinner, Martin and I volunteered to do the dishes. His house, Bethany's kitchen. But Martin and I had a system going back 20 years, and we fell into it naturally. He washed, I dried, we talked about the Ohio State game coming up and whether his truck needed new tires before winter. That's when I heard it. I wasn't meant to, I'm sure of that. Bethany and her mother were in the dining room, while Jean and Craig had gone out to the backyard. And I guess Bethany didn't realize how clearly the kitchen and dining room connected acoustically in that house. Her voice was low, but not low enough. He showed up 45 minutes early, Mom. Rhonda said something I couldn't make out. I know. Bethany again. But you saw him, the coat, the truck. He doesn't exactly blend, does he? I love Martin. You know I do. But his dad just feels so out of place. It's like inviting someone to a dinner party who doesn't know which fork to use and doesn't care to learn. I kept drying the dish in my hand. Martin had gone still beside me. He'd heard it too. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The water was still running. The sounds from the backyard drifted in faint. I finished drying the dish and set it on the counter and reached for the next one. Martin turned the water off. "Dad," he said quietly. "I heard. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for someone else." He stood there with wet hands, and I could see him cycling through what to do with what he was feeling. Martin was always like that. Didn't react fast, thought it through, came out the other side with something purposeful. I used to worry about that when he was a teenager, thinking he was bottling things up. But he wasn't. He was just building. He dried his hands on the dish towel. Then he walked out of the kitchen into the dining room. I stayed where I was. I'm not going to pretend I didn't want to follow him. But this wasn't my moment. This was his house, his marriage, his wife. Whatever happened next, Martin needed to be the one standing in that room. I heard his voice, low and steady. "Bethany, can I talk to you in the other room?" A pause. Then Bethany's heels on the hardwood as she followed him down the hall. I picked up another dish and dried it. Rhonda appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later. Whether she'd come to say something or just couldn't stay in the dining room alone, I couldn't tell. She stood there looking at me the way people look at a situation they know they've contributed to but can't quite claim. "James, you want some more coffee?" I asked. I was going to put a fresh pot on. She blinked. Yes, sure." I filled the carafe and measured out the grounds and turned the machines on, and we stood in that kitchen with the quiet hum of the Thanksgiving house around us, and neither of us mentioned what had just happened. Because what was there to say? She couldn't unhear what her daughter said, and I couldn't unfeel it. And cleaning it up with words in someone else's kitchen wasn't something either of us knew how to do. Martin and Bethany were in that hallway for 11 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the microwave. When they came back, Bethany's eyes were red. Not from crying, from the particular kind of heat that comes from being corrected by someone who loves you and is right. Martin's face was the calm he always had on the other side of a hard conversation. Resolved, not angry, just settled, the way a structure settles after the load is properly distributed. Bethany walked to where I was standing by the coffee maker. She had to work for it. I could see that. Whatever Martin had said to her in that hallway, it hadn't been comfortable, and the result of it wasn't comfortable either. But she stood there in front of me, and she said, "James, I'm sorry. What I said was wrong, and it was unkind, and you didn't deserve to hear it." She wasn't reading from a script. It was effortful and real, and I respected that. "Bethany," I said, "I appreciate that." And I meant it. She nodded and looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked back up. Can we have dessert?" "I made 3 pies. A woman who makes 3 pies," I said, "is a woman I have a lot of time for." She laughed. It was small and a little raw around the edges, but it was real. Martin was watching from the doorway. When I glanced at him, he gave me the smallest nod. The same nod he gave me when he was 10 years old and finished something hard and wanted me to know he was okay. I gave him one back. We had dessert. Jean and Craig came back inside from the backyard and knew nothing of what had happened, or pretended not to, which amounted to the same thing. Rhonda was quieter than she'd been before dinner. Bethany served the pie with a kind of deliberate care, making sure my slice was the biggest. It was pecan, which she had no way of knowing is my favorite, or maybe Martin told her and I just didn't know it. Either way, I drove home that evening with a stomach full of good food and something else. Not satisfaction exactly, more like weight that's been properly placed. The kind that doesn't burden you but grounds you. The drive back to Gary was 5 hours, and I didn't need the radio. I want to be clear about something because I've told this story to a few people since then, and more than one person has asked me why I didn't say something myself, why I let Martin handle it, why I didn't walk into that dining room and address Bethany directly. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years on a plant floor in Gary, Indiana, making something real out of metal and heat and coordinated human effort. I've supervised men younger than Martin. I've had bosses who didn't think much of where I came from. I've been underestimated in rooms more important than a Thanksgiving dining room in Columbus, Ohio. And I've learned that there is a time for a man to speak, and there is a time for a man to be still and let the right person speak. The right person in that room was my son. Not because I couldn't have handled it, but because it meant more coming from him. Because that was the moment that would matter to Bethany. Not a confrontation from a father-in-law she barely knew. The correction from a husband who loved her and expected better anyway. That's what changes people. Martin called me the next morning, early before 8, which told me he hadn't slept much. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," I said. "You?" "I've been thinking about what she said." A pause. "I want you to know that's not how I'm going to let my house run, Dad. That's not what this marriage is going to be." "I know that, son. I need you to actually know it. Not just say it to make me feel better." I sat down at my kitchen table with my coffee. Outside, a cold November morning was just starting to come up gray over the houses across the street. A squirrel was doing something ambitious in the tree by my driveway. "Martin," I said, "you went in that hallway for 11 minutes. You came out, and your wife apologized to me, and then she gave me the biggest slice of pecan pie I've seen since 1994. "I know, son." He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. The real one, the one that sounds like relief. "She knows you like pecan?" "Apparently. I told her back in September. There was a particular kind of warmth in that he'd told her, that she'd remembered, that even in the middle of all the mess of who people are and where they come from and what they think they're better than, a detail from September survived into November and showed up in the form of a pie slice. I'm not a complicated man. I don't need much. But I will say this. 3 months after that, Thanksgiving, Bethany called me on a Sunday. First time she'd ever called me on her own. Usually it was Martin handing her the phone for a minute at the end of our weekly call. She called to tell me about a plumbing problem in their basement and to ask if I knew whether it was the kind of thing that needed a professional or the kind of thing a person could address themselves with a trip to the hardware store. I talked her through it for 45 minutes. At the end of the call, she said, "Thank you, James. I don't know why I didn't just ask you before." I told her she could call any time. She's called 4 times since. Twice about house stuff. Once because she was upset about something at work and apparently needed a voice that wasn't connected to the situation. And once just to check in because she'd heard from Martin that I'd had a cold. That last one's surprised me the most. Didn't have to, but she did. People are not fixed things. That's something I've known since the plant floor. Structures flex under load. Metal that looks rigid will yield if the pressure is applied long enough and at the right angle. People are the same way. The question is never whether someone is capable of better. The question is whether the people around them love them enough to expect it. Martin loves Bethany. And somewhere in that hallway conversation, he told her exactly who his father was and what it meant that she'd spoken about him that way. Not as an attack, as an explanation, as a line. And she heard him. The coat I wore to Thanksgiving was a brown canvas Carhartt I've owned for 14 years. It's got a small burn mark on the left sleeve from a spark that jumped on the plant floor in 2010, and a repair on the collar where the stitching came loose, and I fixed it myself. It's warm and it fits me, and I've never felt the need to replace it. I wore it home from Columbus that night. I wore it to Christmas in Columbus 6 weeks later. Nobody said a word about it. And Martin, when I came through the front door and he hugged me the way he always does, hard, like he means it, I felt him touch the back of that old Carhartt for just a moment, just a hand between the shoulder blades. The way you touch something you're glad is still there.